My brother took credit for everything. One letter changed his life. I was sitting in the back row of the boardroom, the same seat I'd occupied for 6 years, when my father stood up and said my brother's name instead of mine. "Marcus will be taking over as CEO," he said. And the room broke into applause, the kind of applause that sounds like a held breath finally being let out. Clap too. I don't know why. Maybe because that's what you do when your hands don't know what else to do with themselves. Maybe because some part of me still believed even then that there had been a mistake, that any second my father would look over at me and say, "Wait, no, I misspoke, I meant Ethan." He never looked over. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was smaller and colder than rage. It was the feeling of watching your own name get erased from something you built with your hands, in real time, while everyone around you smiles like nothing is wrong. It was the feeling of being a ghost at your own funeral. Because the plan Marcus was being celebrated for, the restructuring that pulled coal manufacturing back from the edge of bankruptcy, the plan that saved 400 jobs and turned 11 straight months of losses into our first profitable quarter in 3 years, that plan was mine. Every spreadsheet, every late night, every phone call to suppliers in 3 time zones, begging for 30 more days on an invoice so we could make payroll. Mine. Marcus had walked into my office 9 months earlier, looked at my screen for maybe 90 seconds and said, "This is good, Ethan. Really good." Then he'd walked out. 2 weeks later, he presented that plan to our father as his own vision for saving the company. I found out only because I happened to be in the hallway outside the conference room, close enough to hear my own words coming out of my brother's mouth, delivered with the kind of confidence I never had, the kind of confidence that made grown men in that room nod along like they were witnessing genius. I didn't say anything that day either. I told myself I would later, privately, when it wouldn't seem like I was trying to steal his moment. I told myself there would be time to set the record straight. There's always a version of yourself that believes there will be time. There wasn't. By the time the board voted on succession, the story had calcified into something nobody questioned anymore. Marcus saved the company. Marcus was ready to lead. Marcus was, in my father's words, finally stepping into who he was always meant to be. And I sat in the back row and clapped, because 34 years of being the quiet son had taught me that arguing never won you anything in this family. It only made you look bitter. It only made you look small. So I went home that night to my wife Sarah, and when she asked how the meeting went, I told her it went fine. I told her Marcus got the promotion. I did not tell her the promotion was built on my work, because saying it out loud would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for it to be real yet. I remember standing in our kitchen while she reheated leftovers, watching the microwave light flicker across the counter, and thinking about how strange it was that a man could lose the most important thing he'd built in his professional life, and still come home and eat pasta and ask his kid about her homework like nothing had happened. Our daughter Lily was 7 then, and she showed me a drawing she'd made at school. A house with too many windows and a sun with a smiling face crammed into the corner of the page, and I told her it was the best drawing I'd ever seen, and for about 90 seconds holding that piece of paper I forgot entirely about the boardroom. Then I remembered, and the forgetting made the remembering worse, the way stepping out of a warm house into cold air always feels colder than the cold actually is. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Sarah in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow, patient circles, and I ran the boardroom scene over and over in my mind, searching each replay for some detail I might have missed, some moment where I could have spoken up and changed the outcome. I never found one. That's the cruelest part of hindsight. It doesn't show you your mistakes so you can fix them. It just shows you again and again exactly how powerless you were the first time. I should tell you a little about my family, because none of this makes sense without understanding the architecture of it first. My father, Richard Cole, took over coal manufacturing from his own father, a man named Walter Cole, back in the 90s. Richard was a good businessman in the way that certain men of his generation are good businessmen. Decisive, a little cold, allergic to sentiment unless it served a purpose. He loved his sons, I believe that, but he loved us the way you love a set of tools, evaluating us by what we produced rather than who we were. Marcus produced charisma. I produced results. In my father's ledger, charisma was always worth more, because charisma was what he understood, what he'd built his own career on. Results were just something you expected from the machinery. My mother, Diane, mostly stayed out of business matters, though she had her own quiet ways of choosing favorites, ways that showed up in smaller currencies, whose achievements got mentioned first at dinner, whose failures got explained away as just a rough patch versus whose failures got filed away as evidence of character. And then there was my grandfather, Walter. Walter Cole died when I was 26, 3 years before any of this happened, and if you'd asked me back then what he thought of Marcus and me, I would have told you he loved us equally. He was that kind of grandfather, generous with his attention, careful never to play favorites in front of us. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Walter had been watching us far more closely than any of us realized, and that he had drawn conclusions long before he died, conclusions he never spoke aloud to a single living person except one. I didn't think about my grandfather much in the weeks after Marcus's promotion. I was too busy drowning in something quieter than grief. I kept going to work. I kept doing my job, except now my job had a new manager, and that manager was my brother. It's a strange kind of humiliation, watching someone give you instructions on a project you designed. Marcus would walk into my office, glance at a report I was preparing and say things like, "Maybe simplify this for the board, they don't need all the technical detail." And I would nod and say, "Sure, Marcus," and something in my chest would fold in on itself a little more each time. There was a particular smell to my office in those weeks, stale coffee and printer toner, and I remember noticing it more than I ever had before. The way you notice small physical details when your mind is trying to distract itself from something larger it doesn't want to feel. I started arriving earlier than everyone else, not because there was more work to do, but because the empty building at 6 in the morning was the only place left where I didn't have to perform composure for anyone. I could sit at my desk in the gray early light, drink my coffee, and just be angry quietly, privately, before the day required me to smile at people who no longer seemed to remember whose idea had saved their jobs. One morning, a woman from the shipping department named Carol stopped by my desk to drop off a form, and almost as an afterthought, she mentioned how relieved everyone in her department had been when Marcus's plan went into effect, how it had meant the difference between keeping her job and losing it. I told her I was glad it had helped. I didn't correct her. I sat there afterward staring at the stack of forms on my desk, thinking about how history gets written by whoever is standing closest to the microphone when the applause starts, regardless of who actually did the work that earned it. The thing about quiet humiliation is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a single unbearable moment you can point to and say that's when it broke me. It comes in inches. It comes in the fact that people stopped copying me on emails they used to copy me on. It comes in the fact that my father started introducing Marcus at company events as the future of coal manufacturing, while I stood a few feet away, unintroduced, unmentioned, a fixture of the background like the potted plants near the entrance. I want to be honest with you. There were nights I sat in my car in the parking garage after everyone else had gone home, not ready to drive back and perform normalcy for Sarah, just sitting there with the engine off, feeling like I was disappearing. It was on one of those nights about 6 weeks after the promotion that I got the phone call that started everything. It was from a man named Nathaniel Reyes. I didn't recognize the name at first, and almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. He introduced himself as an attorney, and told me he had handled my grandfather's estate. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I've been instructed to reach out to you specifically, under a set of conditions your grandfather outlined before his passing. Those conditions have now been met." I remember sitting very still in that dark parking garage, my phone pressed to my ear, feeling the particular cold that comes right before something important happens, the cold that your body somehow recognizes before your mind catches up. "What conditions?" I asked. "I'd rather explain in person," he said. "Could you come to my office on Thursday?" I didn't sleep much that week. I ran through every possibility. Maybe it was nothing, some routine formality tied to a trust one already knew about. Maybe my grandfather had left me a small keepsake, a watch, a set of tools from his workshop, the kind of sentimental gesture that dies with old men and gets handled by lawyers because nobody else wants to deal with the paperwork. I told myself not to hope for anything larger than that. Hoping for more felt dangerous, felt like setting myself up to be disappointed one more time by a family that had already made its priorities clear. Thursday came. Nathaniel Reyes's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all dark wood and the particular hush that expensive law offices seem to cultivate on purpose. He was an older man, silver-haired, with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades watching families come apart over money, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He set a thin folder on the desk between us before he said a word. Your grandfather came to me 4 years before he died, he said. And he asked me to prepare something very specific. He asked me to hold a sealed letter, along with a set of instructions, and to only act on them if certain circumstances arose within coal manufacturing after his death. What circumstances? I asked. He told me, Reyes said, that if control of the company ever passed to Marcus over you, based on a claim of achievement that you yourself had actually produced, I was to open this letter and share its contents with you directly. I sat there in that leather chair and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. He knew, I said mostly to myself. He suspected, Reyes corrected gently. Your grandfather told me he'd watched a pattern repeat itself for years. Small things mostly. A project at a family barbecue where Marcus took credit for an idea that came from you. A story your grandfather overheard your father tell at a golf outing about Marcus's business instincts, describing almost word for word something he'd previously heard from you in private. He said he never had proof. He said it was just a feeling, a pattern he couldn't quite prove, but that troubled him enough to prepare for the possibility that it might happen again, at a scale that actually mattered. He slid the folder toward me. I opened it, and inside was a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, the same handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and the notes he used to leave in my workshop toolbox when I was a teenager learning to build things beside him. I'm not going to read you the whole letter, because some things are private even in a story like this one, but I'll tell you what mattered most. My grandfather wrote that he had never been able to say certain things while he was alive, because he didn't want to create conflict in a family that already had enough of it simmering under the surface. He wrote that he had watched me since I was a boy, quietly building things, quietly solving problems, quietly stepping back and letting other people take the applause, and that it had worried him more than it had ever comforted him. He wrote that quiet people in loud families often disappear, not because they lack anything, but because nobody teaches them that their work deserves to be seen. And then he wrote something that I've thought about every single day since. He wrote, Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the thing I feared happened. It means somebody took what was yours and wore it as their own, and it means your father let them. I can't undo that from where I am. But I can make sure you have what you need to undo it yourself if you choose to. Attached to the letter was a second document. One Reyes explained had been prepared alongside the will itself. It was an amendment to the family trust, one that had been kept separate from the general estate documents specifically so it would not surface unless the conditions Walter described were triggered. The amendment stated that a controlling minority stake in coal manufacturing, shares Walter had personally held outside the company structure, roughly 18%, would transfer not automatically to whoever held the CEO title, but specifically to whichever grandchild could demonstrate through documented evidence that they were the actual originator of any major strategic initiative credited to another family member during a leadership transition. 18% doesn't sound like much until you understand what it meant in practice. Combined with my own existing shares from years of deferred compensation, it would be enough to force a board review. Enough to matter. Enough, if I could prove what I already knew to be true, to change everything. He built in a mechanism, Reyes said, watching my face carefully. He didn't want to hand you power outright because he said that wouldn't be fair to Marcus either, if the suspicion turned out to be wrong. He wanted there to be proof. Real proof. Not accusations. Not family arguments. Documents. I left that office with the folder pressed against my chest like something that might shatter if I loosened my grip, and I sat in my car for a long time before I could make myself drive home. That night I told Sarah everything. All of it. The hallway outside the conference room. The months of small humiliations. The letter. She didn't say much while I talked. She just held my hand across the kitchen table, and when I finished, she asked one question that changed the direction of everything that followed. Do you still have it? She asked. The original file. The first draft before he ever saw it. I hadn't thought about it in weeks, but the moment she asked, I knew the answer. I did still have it. I had everything. Here's something people don't understand about the kind of work I do. Every file I create carries a timestamp, buried in the metadata, invisible unless you know to look for it. Every revision I've ever made lives somewhere, in a folder on a server, in an email thread, in a version history that most people never think to check because most people never expect to need it as proof of anything. I spent the next several days going back through everything, quietly, carefully. After Marcus had left for the day, after the office had emptied out, I found the original restructuring proposal, dated 9 months before Marcus's presentation to the board, with a creation timestamp that placed it weeks before he'd ever walked into my office and looked at my screen for 90 seconds. I found the email thread where I'd sent an early draft to a consultant we occasionally use for financial modeling, a woman named Priya Anand, asking for her feedback on the supplier renegotiation section. I found her reply still sitting in my inbox, praising the framework and asking clarifying questions about numbers that appeared, almost unchanged, in the version Marcus later presented as his own. I found something else too, something I hadn't expected. Buried 3 folders deep in an old shared drive, I found a version of the presentation Marcus had used for the board, and when I opened the file properties, the created by field still listed my name, because he had built his presentation by copying my original document and editing it, rather than starting from scratch. He had changed the title slide. He had changed the framing language throughout. But he'd never scrubbed the metadata because most people don't think to. Most people don't expect anyone to look. I printed everything. I made copies of everything. I put together a folder of my own, a quiet mirror of the one Reyes had handed me, except this one I built myself, evidence by evidence, timestamp by timestamp, until the story it told was undeniable to anyone who actually looked at it honestly. I labeled each document carefully, the way I labeled everything in my professional life, with dates and version numbers, because I understood instinctively that a pile of proof means nothing if it isn't organized well enough for a stranger to follow without help. I made a simple spreadsheet, 1 column for each piece of evidence, 1 column for the date it was created, 1 column for what it proved. It felt strange building a legal case out of the same tools I used to build supply chain models, but the discipline of it was steadying. It gave my hands something precise to do, while the rest of me was still absorbing the shape of what had happened. I found a text message thread too, one I'd almost forgotten about, from the week before Marcus's board presentation, where he'd asked me casually, "Hey, what were those numbers again on the supplier terms? I want to make sure I explain it right to Dad." And I'd typed out the full breakdown for him, 3 paragraphs long, patient and detailed, the way you help family without a second thought. I read that message again with new eyes, and felt something twist in my stomach, because I could see now in hindsight, exactly how deliberately casual his question had been, how carefully worded to sound like clarification rather than theft. I also found an old voicemail, still saved on my phone from months earlier, from Priya Anand, the consultant, praising the plan by name, referring to it out loud as "your restructuring proposal, Ethan," recorded 3 weeks before Marcus ever brought the idea to our father. I played it back more than once, sitting alone at my kitchen table late at night after Sarah and Lily had gone to bed, and something about hearing another person's voice confirm what I already knew made the whole ordeal feel less like something I'd imagined out of hurt feelings and more like something that had actually verifiably happened to me. I didn't confront Marcus right away. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. Part of me was afraid. Not of him exactly, but of what it would mean if I was wrong, if there was some explanation I hadn't considered, some version of events where this wasn't really theft, just an honest misunderstanding blown out of proportion by my own hurt feelings. I needed to be certain before I said anything, because once I said it, there would be no taking it back. So instead I watched. I watched the way Marcus handled his new role over the following weeks, and what I saw troubled me more than the original theft had. He wasn't just taking credit for the past. He was struggling with the present. Decisions that should have taken him an hour took him days, because he didn't actually understand the underlying mechanics of the plan he was supposedly the architect of. He asked me more than once to walk him through the numbers again, phrasing it casually like he was just double-checking, but I could see the panic underneath it, the panic of a man standing on a stage he didn't build and hoping nobody notices the floor is unfamiliar beneath his feet. There was one afternoon I won't forget. We were in a supplier negotiation call together, and the vendor pushed back on a payment term and Marcus froze. Just froze for 3 or 4 seconds that felt much longer, before I quietly typed a suggested counteroffer on a notepad and slid it across the table to him. He read it off almost verbatim, and the vendor accepted, and afterward Marcus thanked me in the hallway, quietly, almost apologetically, in a tone I hadn't heard from him before. "You're really good at this," he said. "I don't know how you make it look so easy." I remember looking at him and feeling something complicated, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity, sitting somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Because in that moment I understood something about my brother I hadn't let myself see clearly before. He hadn't taken credit for my work because he was some calculating villain twirling a mustache in the shadows. He'd taken it because he was drowning, because our father's approval had always been conditional on results Marcus didn't naturally produce, and somewhere along the way he'd learned that the fastest route to that approval was borrowing someone else's results and calling them his own. It didn't make what he did right. But it made it human in a way that made the whole situation heavier rather than lighter. Still, understanding why someone hurts you doesn't erase the hurt, and it doesn't mean you owe them your silence forever. The moment that pushed me toward finally acting came about 2 months after the promotion, at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, the kind of dinner our family had been having for as long as I could remember, roast chicken and my mother's insistence that everyone sit in their assigned seats even though we were all adults now. My father raised a glass that night, and made a toast to Marcus, calling him the son who saved this family's legacy. And my mother beamed, and Marcus accepted the praise with a small, humble smile that I now understood was performance rather than modesty. And I sat there in my assigned seat, and felt something in me settle into a decision I hadn't fully admitted to myself I'd already made. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to make a scene at a dinner table and become the bitter brother who ruined a family celebration out of jealousy, because that's exactly the story my father would tell afterward if I gave him the chance. I needed something quieter than that. Something undeniable. I called Nathaniel Reyes on Monday morning and asked him to help me schedule a formal review with the board, using the mechanism my grandfather had built into the trust. He told me the process was straightforward. I would need to present documented evidence to the board's independent trustee committee, a group of 3 people, none of them family, who had been appointed years earlier specifically to handle disputes exactly like this one, disputes my grandfather had apparently anticipated with a clarity none of us had given him credit for while he was alive. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. I spent those 3 weeks building the strongest, most careful case I could, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a desire finally to simply be seen accurately for the first time in longer than I could remember. I didn't tell my parents what was coming. I didn't tell Marcus either. Reyes explained that the process required formal notice to all relevant parties only 72 hours before the hearing, and I chose to use every hour of that window because I understood, somewhere in my chest, that once they knew, the next 72 hours would be the hardest of my life, filled with calls and arguments and attempts to talk me out of it, and I needed to be steady before that storm arrived. When the notice went out, my mother called me 11 times in one evening. I let most of them go to voicemail. The ones I answered were difficult, her voice cracking between confusion and something that sounded almost like fear, asking why I was doing this, whether I understood what it would do to the family, whether this was really about the company or whether it was about something older, something between me and Marcus that went back to childhood. I told her gently that it was about the truth. I told her I loved this family enough to finally tell it. My father didn't call at all. He sent one email, 3 lines long, formal in a way that felt like a wound in itself, informing me that he hoped I understood the seriousness of what I was doing, and that he trusted the process would clarify things. I read that email a dozen times trying to find warmth in it, and never quite found any. Marcus texted me at midnight the night before the hearing. Just one message. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" I stared at that message for a long time before I answered. I finally wrote back. "I tried once in a hallway 9 months ago. You didn't hear me then. I'm hoping the board will." He didn't respond after that. The hearing was held in a smaller conference room than I expected. Just the 3 trustees, Reyes representing the estate's interests, my parents, Marcus, and me. No cameras, no dramatics, nothing like the confrontations you see in movies. Just a long table, a stack of folders, and the particular silence of people who all knew something important was about to happen and none of them fully knew what. I remember the room smelled faintly of the coffee someone had brewed before we arrived, and I remember focusing on that smell, on something small and ordinary, because it was the only way I could keep my hand steady while I set my folder down on the table. My mother sat across from me in a blue cardigan I recognized from a dozen other family gatherings, and she wouldn't look at me directly, her eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as though avoiding my face could somehow keep this from becoming as real as it was about to become. My father sat beside her, upright, unreadable, the same posture he used in every important meeting I'd ever watched him sit through, and Marcus sat at the far end, his hands folded in front of him, looking, for the first time in months, younger than his age, almost like the version of him I remembered from childhood, the one who used to get quietly nervous before piano recitals he hadn't practiced enough for. One of the trustees, a woman named Ms. Okafor, opened the proceedings by reading a brief summary of the conditions outlined in my grandfather's amendment, her voice calm and procedural, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something with this much weight in my life was being handled with such ordinary, businesslike patience, no different in tone than a discussion about quarterly budgets. I spoke first because Reyes had arranged it that way. I didn't raise my voice once. I laid out the timeline quietly, methodically, the way I would present any project at work, except this project was my own life. I showed them the original file, its creation date 9 months before Marcus's board presentation. I showed them the email exchange with Priya Anand, her reply still sitting untouched in my inbox for anyone to verify. I showed them the metadata on Marcus's own presentation file, the created by field that still quietly, undeniably read my name. I watched my father's face change while I spoke. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no dropped folder, no movie moment. Just a slow tightening around his eyes, the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do, watching a story he'd told himself for months come apart thread by thread under the weight of dates and file properties that didn't care about anyone's feelings. Marcus didn't interrupt me. I think on some level he had been waiting for this for weeks, maybe longer, the way you wait for weather you can feel coming even before the sky changes. When I finished, one of the trustees asked him directly whether he disputed any of the documents presented. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I don't dispute it." My mother made a small sound beside him, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but Marcus kept talking, and what he said next surprised me more than anything else that day. "I took it because I didn't think I had anything of my own good enough to offer," he said, looking at our father, not at me. "I've spent my whole life watching you look at Ethan's work like it was gold and looking at mine like it was fine, just fine, and I got so tired of being just fine that when I saw something that would finally make you proud, I told myself it didn't matter whose idea it started as long as it worked. I told myself I'd earn it later, that I'd grow into deserving it. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Ethan. I've been sorry for a while. I just didn't know how to say it without losing everything. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, but mostly I felt tired and sad in a way I hadn't expected. Not sad that the truth had come out. Sad that it had taken this much machinery, this much evidence, this much formal process, for two brothers to finally say something honest to each other in front of the people who should have made it safe to say honest things all along. The trustees deliberated for less than 20 minutes. When they returned, their decision was calm and procedural in the way legal decisions usually are, stripped of the emotional weight carried by everyone sitting around that table. Based on the documented evidence, they ruled that I was the originator of the strategic plan credited to Marcus during the leadership transition, and per the terms of my grandfather's trust amendment, the 18% controlling stake would transfer to me, effective immediately. They also recommended, though did not require, that the board revisit the CEO appointment given the material misrepresentation involved in the original decision. My father didn't say anything for a long time after the trustees left the room. It was just the four of us then, my parents, Marcus and me, sitting in the quiet aftermath of something that had taken months to build and 20 minutes to unravel. Finally my father looked at me, and I want to tell you his eyes were full of some cinematic remorse, but that's not quite what it was. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, something closer to the look of a man realizing he had spent years building his understanding of his own family on a foundation he never bothered to check. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "I saw the plan land in front of me from Marcus, and I wanted so badly for it to be him, for it to finally be him, that I never once thought to ask where it really came from. That's on me, Ethan. Not just on your brother. On me." It wasn't the apology I'd imagined during those long nights in the parking garage. It didn't undo months of being overlooked. But it was honest, and coming from my father, honesty had always been rarer than approval, so I let it matter. In the weeks that followed, the board did revisit the leadership decision, quietly, without public announcement, without any of the drama that would have made for a more satisfying story if this were fiction instead of something that actually happened to my family. Marcus stepped down from the CEO role voluntarily, before the board could formally act, and asked instead to move into an operations position under new leadership, a role, he told me privately, that finally matched what he actually knew how to do rather than what he'd hoped he could fake his way through. I didn't take the CEO title either, not right away. I told the board I needed time, and they respected that, which was its own kind of vindication, being trusted enough that my hesitation was read as wisdom rather than weakness. Eventually, about 4 months later, I did accept the role, but by then it didn't feel like revenge anymore. It felt like something quieter and sturdier than that. It felt like finally standing in a place that had always structurally belonged to me, except now everyone else could see it too. Marcus and I are not the way we used to be, and I don't think we ever will be, not exactly, but we are talking again slowly, carefully, the way people talk when they're relearning trust from the ground up. He came to my office a few weeks after everything settled, and instead of asking me to walk him through numbers, he asked me something different. He asked me to teach him, really teach him from the beginning, the actual mechanics of the plan he'd once pretended to have built alone. I said yes. I think some part of me needed to say yes, needed to prove to myself that I could be generous now that I finally had nothing left to prove. My mother still struggles with all of it, I think, still wishes there had been some version of this where nobody's feelings got hurt and the family photo stayed as tidy as it always used to look. I understand that wish, even if I don't share it anymore. Some families stay tidy by keeping their truths buried. I decided somewhere in that quiet hallway 9 months earlier that I didn't want to be part of a family like that anymore, no matter how much smoother the surface looked. My grandfather never got to see any of this. He died believing only that something might go wrong someday, never knowing for certain that it would, never knowing that the boy he used to watch quietly building things in his workshop would grow into a man who had to fight, carefully and without raising his voice, just to have his own work called by his own name. I visited his grave a few weeks after the hearing, on a quiet weekday afternoon when the cemetery was mostly empty. I brought the letter with me, the original, folded back into its envelope, and I sat there for a long time, not saying much out loud, just letting myself feel the particular gratitude of being seen by someone who had died before he ever got to say it to my face. I think about that letter often now, especially the last line, the one that has stayed with me longer than anything else in this entire story. My grandfather wrote, "The people who build quietly are often the last to be believed, and the first to be forgotten. Don't let them forget you, Ethan. Not because you need the credit, but because the truth deserves to exist somewhere other than inside your own chest." I don't know if I'm a different person now than I was in that boardroom, clapping for a brother who had taken something that was mine and worn it like it had always belonged to him. I think, in some ways, I'm exactly the same person I always was, still quiet, still more comfortable with spreadsheets than speeches. But I no longer believe that quiet has to mean invisible. I no longer believe that being overlooked is simply the price you pay for being the kind of person who does the work instead of performing it. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just a folder of documents, laid out calmly on a table, letting the truth speak in a voice steadier than anyone's anger ever could. Sometimes it's a letter written by a man who's already gone, trusting that somewhere down the line, the people he loved would need exactly what he'd quietly prepared for them, long before they even knew to ask. My name is on the door now. Not because I fought for it the way Marcus once fought for approval he was afraid he'd never earn honestly, but because, in the end, the truth was patient enough to wait for the right moment to be believed, and I was patient enough to wait with it.